Now, I start my talks, as my son can tell you, with a little good news, and I do it on purpose, mainly because I know most people don't expect a lot of good news from the press. That's one of my recurring questions. I'm always reminded of something that Jimmy Carter said at an off-the-record dinner with reporters on New Year's Eve, 1980, in Plains, Georgia, just 3 weeks before he left office. Now, I'd only covered former Governor Reagan for a week in that campaign. I was the White House correspondent, so I had to stick with President Carter, the incumbent. So I was only out a week with Reagan, and when Reagan won, I felt really behind the curve. And so I decided to skip President Carter's last trip to Plains, Georgia as president and catch up and bone up on President-elect Reagan. So I missed this off-the-record dinner with reporters. Since I wasn't there, I'm not bound by the off-the-record rule. I can tell you what happened because somebody who was there told me what happened. What happened is right before midnight, President Carter got up and offered a toast. And he said in his toast, "I wish two things for Ronald Reagan, my successor. I wish him Menachem Begin and the Israelis, and I wish him Sam Donaldson and all the rest of you jerks in the press." My college roommate, who is a lawyer in El Paso, puts it a little differently. He says, "Y'all's motto on the media is very simple. If you don't have anything nice to say, let's hear it." Well, I don't entirely believe that. I don't entirely buy that, but I do understand why an awful lot of people feel that way about the press. So that's another reason why I have good news this morning, at least at the start here. My good news is that whatever you think about Barack Obama, however you voted in the last presidential election, no matter how you intend to vote in less than 2 years, it should be clear by now that we have a real leader of strength and determination and resolve in Washington. But Gary didn't ask me to talk about Hillary Clinton. So I won't, but maybe in a little bit. Stay tuned, we'll see. Now, before I start my advertised topic, I hope you will indulge me in a very brief detour down memory lane. As Gary told you, I've done this a long time, since the summer of 1968. I've been in Washington ever since, not up for parole yet. And I'm frequently asked the same two questions. One is, what was the greatest story you've ever covered? And people who look at my resume would probably conclude that it was the resignation of Richard Nixon and the inauguration of Gerald Ford. Now, it is true that I was on the south lawn of the White House that fateful day, August 9th, 1974, a Friday. I will tell the rest of that story at my next lecture next Thursday, excuse me. I'll tell the rest of the story of what it was like that day. But for now, I will say that was a great story to have covered, but it wasn't the greatest story I ever covered. The greatest story I ever covered was out in this part of the world, February the 12th, 1973, and it was the return of the American prisoners of war from Vietnam at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. I was 27 years old and had no idea of what lay ahead for me in journalism. I still remember the moment when those American prisoners of war came off the C-141s at Clark Air Base. If you had been there, you would have gotten, as I did, a fresh lesson in the resilience of the American spirit. These guys were broken in body, but they weren't broken in spirit. I still remember what they were wearing. They were wearing these pea green, cheap windbreakers, blue cotton pants, and some sort of a khaki shirt, and they all looked like they weighed 95 pounds. They were emaciated. Many of them looked like they should have been in wheelchairs, but I learned much later that they all got together and said, "None of us are coming off in wheelchairs. It will send the wrong symbol." And they were extraordinary, and the power of their mere disembarkation from the airplanes and the words they spoke still remain with me today. That was the biggest story I've ever covered. It's the only story I've ever covered where even reporters were in tears, and if you had been there, you'd have been in tears too. Quite a story that day. Other question I always get is, well, who's your favorite president? And I always say, not my job to have favorites, and I'll say it here again. Whatever I say, good or bad or neutral or indifferent about presidents in this talk and in the next two talks, I don't love them, I don't loathe them, I cover them. There's a big difference. I try to be as honest in my appraisals as I can, but I don't have favorite presidents. But I will say, if you ask me which president I had the most fun covering, I'll say it was Gerald Ford, but not when he was president. That wasn't as much fun. Gerald Ford was really fun when he was vice president, not only because it was an extraordinary moment in American history, Watergate, where those of us, the 5 of us who traveled with Gerald Ford in a twin-engine Convair, no Imperial Air Force II, it was a very un-Imperial Air Force II. It's still flying. It fights fires for the province of Saskatchewan in Canada now. They've stripped all the seats out. There's a belly tank, but my fondest memories in journalism are grounded in 8 months when I traveled on that tiny little airplane with the guy that was going to be the next president of the United States sooner or later. As it turned out, sooner. That was the most fun I've ever had covering presidents. But as presidents go, the most fun I ever covered was George H.W. Bush, Bush 41. Not out of ideology or politics or anything other than the fact that he was unpredictable. You know, never knew what he was going to do. You never knew when he was going to go. You never knew how the words were going to come tumbling out of his mouth. Clearly a genetic pass-through there from father to son. And you never knew where he was going to go. He loved to go and travel on a moment's notice. He once said to me, "Have you ever stopped to reflect that if you get 8 hours of sleep a night, you've thrown away a third of your life sleeping?" Well, he was determined not to throw a third of his life away sleeping, and it must have worked because he's 86 and a half now, starting to falter, but he's had a long and rich and full life for sure. He just didn't like to sit around, and when he traveled places, he didn't want to go to a hotel room and sit around. Now, I know many of you have been to as if my family and I have been to the Temple of Karnak in Luxor. Well, when Bush was vice president, he wanted to go see the tombs in the Valley of the King. He especially wanted to see King Tut's tomb. And so after a couple of days on the road in Israel and Jordan and Egypt, he flew to Luxor and got in the afternoon before because, as all of you know, it's not exactly cool in Luxor in the middle of August. So he got in early. He decided he didn't want to sit in his air-conditioned hotel room for the afternoon. So at 4 in the afternoon, in the middle of August, we all went off to the Temple of Karnak, where it was 112 degrees and 90% humidity. I'm from Houston, Texas. I know a little bit about humidity. If anybody who's been to Singapore, as all of us recently have, know a little bit about humidity. But that was the most dangerous combination of heat and humidity I've ever been around. Only because George Bush 41 didn't want to sit in a hotel room. That's the way he was. Peripatetic is to put it mildly, and for those of us who covered Ronald Reagan, Bush's schedule was especially burdensome. Ronald Reagan was a lot of things, and leisurely was definitely one of them, thanks to Nancy Reagan. Reagan is the only president in history who would spend 3 nights in Helsinki resting up for the 90-minute flight to Moscow. My kind of guy, that's for sure, my kind of president. Now, Bush was fun to cover because he offered the press more access. Bush 41 had more press conferences in 4 years than his son had in 8 years. But some of 41's access was not what you thought it was going to be. There was the time he was in Europe, one of his early trips to Europe. Friday afternoon, he gets on Air Force One and flies straight home from Germany to Kennebunkport. But right before he leaves, he gets 2 cases of really good German wine from his friend, Chancellor Helmut Kohl. The next morning, nonstop flight. The only way you can fly nonstop from Frankfurt to Kennebunkport is to be on Air Force One or in his entourage. 11 a.m. the next morning, my beeper went off. It was a cryptic message, be at Walker's Point in 1 hour. That's his home. Well, you know your weekend has just gone down the drain. Either news has happened in the world and the President of the United States wants to react to that news, or he's decided to make a little news to dominate the Sunday morning papers. So I dragged myself out of bed, severe jet lag. I got to his home and I was wrong on all counts. He just wanted to have a wine and cheese party with this wine he'd gotten in Frankfurt a few hours before. Classic Bush party, wine, cheese, horseshoes, rides in the speedboat, all those things you've heard about the Bush clan in Kennebunkport. And afterwards, about a dozen members of his family, a dozen aides, and a handful of reporters were standing on the balcony of his home overlooking the Atlantic Ocean drinking this great German wine. except Bush. He was drinking some cheap white stuff from a carafe, and so I very innocently asked him why he wasn't drinking the good stuff. I thought he'd say something like, well, I wanted to be a gracious host and save the good stuff for my guests. I can get it some other time, but I was wrong. He looked at me, gave me this strange look, and he grabbed my arm and he said, you know, I had a good, successful trip in Germany. Can't talk about it, but it was successful, so I'm feeling generous. I'm feeling so generous that I'm going to give you an exclusive. Now, this was a big deal because he hated Newsweek, where I used to work, because the day he announced for president in October of 1987, Newsweek called him a wimp on the cover of the magazine. Some would tell you that the demise of Newsweek as it used to be, it directly goes back to the wimp cover of 13 years ago. I don't believe that, but the Bushes like to believe it because they think it's poetic justice. Anyway, I thought it was pretty good that I was going to get an exclusive given what he thinks about Newsweek. So he grabs my arm, he pulls me close, and he whispers this in my ear: here is your exclusive. I don't like German wine. I didn't want this stuff around my house. So, he says, I woke up at 4 with the jet lag thing, and I said to Barr, what better way to get rid of this wine than invite some reporters over, let them drink it all up for us. So much for that special access. Now, 41 was more fun to cover also because of his endearingly goofy style of oratory. I don't mean any disrespect by that, but I know you know what I'm talking about. I have a dozen stories about Bush's loopy, strange language. I think my favorite was contained in a letter I got a couple of weeks after the election of 1992. As I said, I've covered the Bush family for a long time. I was introduced to George Bush 41 when he was the U.S. rep to the People's Republic of China. He had a reception the day before Thanksgiving in 1974. I was traveling with Henry Kissinger. And that was so long ago, Beijing was still known as Peking. That's how long ago it was. And so I thought that I could probably get a letter to him. And so I wrote him a personal note asking if he would talk with me about his feelings about getting beaten by Bill Clinton. I couched it a little more delicately than that. 3 days later, I got a letter back, and it is one of those classics that's in my safe deposit box now. It begins by saying, Tom, I have decided that I don't need to have my colon cleansed right now by thinking about the N word or the T word, maybe another time, GB. Well, the N word was Newsweek, the T word was Time. He had concluded that Newsweek and Time had been leading cheers for Bill Clinton during that campaign. He was right up to a point, but he did not want to think about the embarrassing loss that it took him a long time to get over. That's one of many letters I have that I have begun annotating because Bush's alternative language is such that if somebody, my son Andrew, pulls that letter and other letters out of a safe deposit box 25 years from now, if you don't have the CliffsNotes on those letters, you won't have the slightest idea what George Bush was talking about. It is, as I said, alternative English. So I've been writing down, here's what this is all about. And one of the reasons why Bush was fun to cover. My favorite Bush blooper was when he was vice president and he made a speech on a Sunday night in Twin Falls, Idaho on agricultural policy. You knew there wasn't going to be any news, and you knew that even if there was news, you were dead in the water because this was before the internet. Now you can put it on the internet in 5 minutes. Then I had 6 days till my next publication. He could have declared war, and we couldn't have gotten it in those days. So I wasn't paying a lot of attention to this speech, especially after they put out a prepared for delivery version, which was totally boring, hopeless, didn't even have a good line anywhere in it. He had one line where he said, I'm proud to have been associated with Ronald Reagan. We've had a lot of success in the last 8 years. After 2 martinis at dinner, it came out a little differently. What he actually said was, I'm proud to have been associated with Ronald Reagan. We've had a lot of sex in the last 8 years.